Quencez. I'm the managing director of our risk and strategy program here at the German Marshall Fund. I'm very happy to host and chair this discussion today on the Transatlantic Trends. The Trends is an annual publication, a flagship publication, in fact, for the German Marshall Fund that is released annually and that is based on a public opinion survey that we conduct in 14 countries on both sides of the Atlantic. And in a way, we ask a great variety of international questions to the population in the US, in Canada, in 11 countries on this side, in Europe, in Turkey, questions related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, to our engagement with China, to the state of the transatlantic relationship, the state of our democracies. And it gives us a sense of what the population and the public opinion sees and perceives in the world today. I have a copy here, but you can find the full report on our website, gmfus.org, with all the data, all the graphs, the methodology, and all the questions you may have. This gives me an opportunity to thank our partners, the BBVA Foundation, the FLAT Foundation, and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in Ankara for their support, as well as Quanta Public, who conducted the survey in all 14 countries. We'll spend the next 60 minutes or so to analyze the results, try to understand what it means for the US and for Europe, what it may mean also in light of the coming elections in Europe and in the United States in 2024, and also have different perspectives with our three panelists today, and I'm very happy to introduce them now. Alexandra de Scheffer is the Senior Vice President for Geostrategy at the German Marshall Fund based here in Paris. Thank you, Alexandra, for being with us. Shashank Joshi is the Defense Editor at The Economist, joining from very near London, as I understand. And finally, Teri Schultz is a freelance reporter based in Brussels, working with numerous outlets, among them NPR and Deutsche Welle. Thank you very much, all three, for joining us today. We will give you 7-8 minutes to provide sort of introductory remarks. After what I will moderate the discussion. I will take questions, and to all of you looking at this event today, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to ask your questions. So we'll take them directly from there. This is on the record, obviously, and we will stop at 4:30 p.m. Central European Time sharp. So without further ado, let me turn first to Alexandra to discuss the state of the transatlantic relationship in a changing global order. So Alexandra, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Martin, and delighted to share this panel with Shashank and Teri. I also want to thank all of those who contributed to this report, and notably my colleague, Gesine Weber, who's truly the brain behind this report. So let me just introduce some of the, what I think were the most striking trends on my side, and then very happy to listen to what the other panelists have to share. But I would say from a broad perspective, I think it's extremely important to understand public priorities and concerns, so that we have an idea of how people think about their country's influence in world politics. How do they think their country's relationship or partnership with other European partners and the United States, but also Canada and Turkey, because these countries were also included in the survey. And what I think is mostly interesting is that on many key questions, public opinion challenges public policies and decision makers in a fastly changing strategic environment. And that, to me, is the most interesting part of this public opinion survey. The first trend that I see in this report is how transatlantic public opinions are actually adapting to new geopolitical realities, while showing increasing concern for the state of their democracies, for immigration and climate change. And so this is really interesting to see that there is a sort of what I would call a mirror effect between the increasing fragmentation of world politics but also the fragmentation of the political landscapes, both across European countries and in the United States. And of course, we will tackle these issues in more details. But first is the global order. So that's really the big picture. And so we ask American, Europeans, Canadians, Turkish respondents to tell us, how do they perceive the state of world politics today? How do they perceive US, China, the EU's influence in the world? How do they perceive the reliability of Europeans, the United States, etc.? And so the first thing I wanted to share, and my colleague Gesine will share the trends, the pictures of the first trend. We see that across the board, public opinions anticipate major shifts in the global order in the 5 years to come. So the timeline is 2028. And so we've asked the respondents, how do you see the balance of power in the 5 years to come? And so we asked them, how do you see the balance of power today and in the 5 years to come? And the trend you see is namely a decline of the US perceived influence to the benefit of China. And you increasingly see a shift towards a perceived bipolarity. I'll give you a few of the striking figures. 64% of all respondents see the US as the most influential actor in global affairs today in 2023. Only 37% of them still see the United States as the most influential actor in the 5 years to come. So that's a major drop of 27 points in the perception of the United States. On China, you have an increase. Today, 14% across the 14 countries surveyed see China as the most influential power. In 5 years from now, 30%. So there is a leap of 16 points compared to the perception today. Now, what's always interesting, but we won't have time to cover all of that today, is to look at the nuance across Europe and, of course, the divergences between the US and Europeans. I just want to spotlight here Italy and France in particular, because in these two countries, respondents expect China to become clearly more powerful than the United States by 2028. So more than half of the respondents in Italy, 51%, and 45% of the French respondents see a world under Chinese leadership in the next 5 years to come. The Germans have a more bipolar vision, 31% US, which represents a 29-point drop compared to how they perceive US influence today, and 40 and 34 for China, which represents a leap of 19 points. Now, there are other two trends I think are interesting to watch. One is how the younger generation tend to see the world. They see the world as more multipolar. So that's the 18-24 years old. With the EU almost as influential as the United States and China. In the United States, Americans are obviously much more optimistic about the US maintaining its position as the most influential actor in global affairs, but they still anticipate a decline from 87% today to 59% in the 5 years to come. So there's a significant drop of 28 points. And what's interesting is that China today, from an American perspective, is perceived at 7% as the most influential and 19% in the 5 years to come. And so the leap is not as significant as you can see in European countries. Now, I want to zoom on the next slide, which is really about the transatlantic relationship. And this is obviously, as you know, the German Marshall Fund's DNA. What I think is starting to emerge as a trend is that the transatlantic relationship seems to have reached what I would characterize as a peak or a plateau. There is no Ukraine effect. driving the US and European partners closer together compared to last year. There is a sort of continuity. People perceive the transatlantic relation as, just continuing as it is today. You also have a slight decline in people saying that the transatlantic relationship will become closer. So less people think that the US-EU relationship will become closer in the years to come. And so that's something we should take into consideration. Despite the massive support of the United States to Ukraine, the perception of the US and the US global influence also remains mostly unchanged. The United States is not perceived as more reliable by European respondents that were surveyed in this report. And the feeling of respondents about the United States' influence in global affairs has also not changed. What is striking is that the public opinion on US global influence is most negative in Germany, in France, and in Italy. There is an alignment on many questions between these three big European countries, France, Germany, and Italy. Just to give you a sense of the numbers, 39% of the Italians, 35% of the Germans, 34% of the French perceive the US global influence as negative today. You even see a drop in how Germany perceives the US as a reliable partner. The US loses 5 points, from 65% to 60% among Germans who say, yes, the United States is a reliable partner of Germany. You find the same drop in Spain, for example. So these are things that are interesting to analyze. When it comes to Ukraine, and this is something that Teri will be discussing afterwards, what also interesting is to see alignment again between Germans, French, and Italians who are here. They appear as the most reluctant to express support for Ukraine across the board. And that's also something we should notice. And on many questions, there is what I would call a German singularity on the way Germans perceive the US in the world, its reliability, and the way Germans perceive their government's support to Ukraine. Germans are across the board the most critical of their government support to Ukraine. Next slide is, I would say, the intermestic issues that people are concerned about. That is climate change, that is immigration, that is the state of their own democracies. What is striking in this survey is that beyond Russia's war on Ukraine, and by the way, interstate war is not a dominant concern across the board. What really stands out is that in 11 out of 14 countries surveyed, respondents say that climate change and immigration are the most important security challenges for their country to address in the years to come. Only in Romania, Lithuania, Poland, people see war between countries or Russia as the top security challenge. And the importance of climate change as a security challenge is also confirmed over time. In the previous 2 editions of this survey, climate change has always been among the top security challenges, alongside the COVID crisis pandemics until 2021, and alongside Ukraine war in 2022. And this time the trend is striking. Climate and immigration are the top security concern. And so this leads me to a few quick, I would say, conclusions or takeaways we can take from these first results. It confirms that the transatlantic relationship has to reinvent itself in a changing world. The transatlantic only approach is not enough. That's something that I retain from the results I just shared with you. There is first the idea that transatlantic governance needs to pay more attention to these intermestic challenges, climate change, immigration, but also the state of democracy. I didn't go into the detail, but happy to share with you some of the striking results of how people perceive the state of their democracies today, and there is a real concern. And there is also a sort, as I was saying, a plateau effect. People see the transatlantic relationship as not enough, as not sufficient to address today's and tomorrow challenges. And when we ask people, do you want a autonomous EU able to act alone? Or would you rather see a European Union that works with other partners to tackle challenges? Massively, they say we want the EU to work with other partners. And that's a research work that GMF has been conducting as well this year, with looking at countries like India, Brazil, or South Africa, the so-called global swing states or pivot states or middle states. But the idea that we need also to foster these relationships outside of the transatlantic core. Very lastly, I really want to attract your attention on what I see as a significant generational gap. Obviously, the 18-24 years old will shape the future of the transatlantic relationship. And on almost all questions, you can tell that this young age don't perceive world politics or their country or the relationship with China in the same way as their elders do. Just to finish on that, 18-24 years old are more likely than their elders to view US global influence negatively, and China, Russia's influence positively. The young generation is also less convinced than their elders of NATO's importance for their country's security. And they are the most concerned about the climate issue and the most critical of government's action on climate. So they basically, they see the scientific community, the NGOs, and themselves as citizens as being the most active in terms of addressing the climate change issue. And governments are perceived as the last actor addressing that issue. So there's also a call to see governments do more on climate. I'll stop on here, and very happy to engage in the conversation later on.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alexandra. I'm sure we'll have a chance to come back to the generational gap or the state of democracy also in the Q&A session. But let me turn now to Teri to talk about NATO, to talk about the Russian war on Ukraine and the main takeaway that you have for us today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I've always been a big fan of transatlantic trends and have never had to speak about it formally before. So I'm going to be quite informal. I mean, as is my wont anyway. I won't go into nearly as much detail as Alexandra did. But I would like to leave a lot more time for questions because I'm interested in what other people take away from this. So my presentation will be quite my sort of instinctive and maybe even just emotional response to the things that came out of this year's survey. And I don't want to get into Shashank's territory, but I will have to say that the first thing that stands out to me, and some of what I say will be redundant with what Alexandra said, because obviously we're going to have some of the same takeaways or same things that struck us, is really this question about the influence of the United States and the rise of China's in the next 5 years, which is such a short term. If you talk about this, in the next 10 years or by the end of the decade or something that seems quite less tangible, I'm not so surprised. But when you say in the next 5 years, when people respond that they believe that China will overtake the United States as the most influential actor, that is really striking. And again, not to get into the China section, but this has a huge impact on NATO. Because NATO is often seen, of course, as sort of a synonym for U.S. power. And when you see the figures that at the same time, the influence of the EU and Russia doesn't change, meaning that the EU, the influence of the EU will not rise significantly in the eyes of respondents, that's also surprising. So, looking at my perceptions of what these numbers mean for NATO and for transatlantic security, again, as Alexandra mentioned, the number of people who believe that the U.S. is the most influential actor today, 64%, and in 5 years, 37%. I think that's a really big problem for NATO. I mean, whether or not it's actually the case that China will be the most influential actor in the world in 5 years, the fact that people think that means that they are definitely looking at NATO as sort of not as important. Now, you might think that believing that the rise of China is inevitable in the next 5 years might mean that people are more interested in NATO and would like to see NATO as a stronger force, and that's simply not what the answers to the other questions seem to bear out. And the fact, again, as Alexandra mentioned, that this is particularly prevalent among young people, I think is a really big problem for the alliance, who needs to be convincing younger generations who are going to be, producing the diplomats, producing the generals, producing the soldiers, producing the negotiators. If these people don't believe that the transatlantic bond it needs to be the most significant relationship between Europe and the United States and Turkey, then I think it's a really big problem for support for NATO. The figures for China replacing the US as the most influential global actor are seen as highest in Italy at 51 and France at 42, two very strong NATO allies. Again, I find that surprising. And the fact that in Germany, the Netherlands, Romania, Spain, and Turkey, they're almost evenly split on whether the United States or China will be the most influential actor in the next 5 years. So again, whether or not this there is actually a huge turn in world events, and this turns out to be the case, remains to be seen. But I think that it's something that NATO should definitely be looking at in its public diplomacy, and should definitely be focusing more, especially on the younger generation. This is constantly true. And whenever you see young leaders in NATO, climate change does rise to the top of their concerns, not immigration. We haven't seen that in the surveys that I've seen among the young people that NATO brings in. But I guess it's not surprising if you're bringing in countries like Turkey and the United States at the same time. So this sort of thing that struck me as I continue with my glass half empty approach to this is that between the years of 2021 and 2022, there was a surge of 20 percentage points in the popularity of NATO. Last year's survey, 46% of respondents saw NATO as very important to their country's national security, and 78% as just important. So this year, that's actually down a point on both counts. It's now 45% that sees NATO as very important to national security, and 77% that sees it as important. So my question then would be, well, what is important to your national security? If not even half of you respondents see NATO as very important to your national security, what do you consider, sort of the backstop on your country's security? And I mean, there wasn't a follow-up question like that, of course, and there's not a multiple choice answer, but I'd be very interested in finding out what they think is their guarantor if it's not NATO. And the fact that this was also kind of amusing to me, that NATO and the European Union are seen as equally important pillars of national security. Now, this should make the EU very happy, because, of course, it would like to play a stronger role with its strategic compass and coming up with its own rapid response force. This was seen as a very muscular move by Josep Borrell. Of course, we haven't seen it come to fruition yet, but that's in the plans. And the EU must be very pleased with this figure. But I would very much like respondents to say, to explain that, how they think that the European Union is equally as important in their national security. Now, if we look deeper into this question, of course, economic security, if you look at funding for militaries, for education, those all, of course, come from national governments, and that could easily be seen more under the European Union rubric than under the NATO rubric. But I'm nonetheless, again, these figures for me raise more questions, and for me, again, should raise more concerns for NATO about the depth of public faith and public support for NATO. And let me see my other numbers here. And this will be the last one I bring up. A majority of respondents, 55%, predict that the relationship between the US and Europe will neither become closer nor more distant again in the next 5 years. So again, if we look back at this figure of China, of the rise of China to be as influential as the United States, but you don't see the US and Europe coming closer together, I think that should be a big concern for policymakers on both sides of the Atlantic. And I hope they're paying attention to this Transatlantic Trends release. And again, I've been covering NATO for more than 15 years, and we've never seen a bigger reorganization of the alliance. We've never seen more effort being put into making sure that forces could respond quickly to any crisis on NATO territory, could have more depth of reinforcement. This is really the biggest reorganization since the Cold War, and it doesn't seem that NATO is conveying that well to its publics, if they really don't feel that this organization is truly their backbone when it comes to security. I think this is a lesson to public diplomacy practitioners at the alliance and also at the European Union. Again, Alexandra went through support for Ukraine. I think that it's interesting, the high level of support for making Ukraine a member of NATO. From everything I've heard there, and for a member of the EU as well, from everything we've heard at NATO, that's not in the cards any decade soon. Shashank also has sources there that may, have a different view, but there's no way that France and Germany are going to let this happen in the near future, for sure. So that may be interesting among the publics, but that's certainly not what we're hearing among the elites and those people who are actually making the decisions here. So I would just wrap it up with a summary that I see this as mostly not good news for NATO in terms of its outreach. And I think that they should look at this as where they need to place their efforts. I think NATO often knows that it has trouble reaching the general public, has trouble sending its messages to people other than elites. And this is just more evidence that they need to do a better job if they're going to bring in the general public, and especially the younger generations, to believe in the importance of NATO and the transatlantic relationship. So I'll end.
Thank you. No, thank you very much, Teri. No, this was great. And I'm sure we'll have also a chance to come back to the questions related to Ukraine in the Q&A. But let me turn last but not least to Shashank to discuss questions related to China and perhaps also more generally transatlantic cooperation beyond Europe and the US. So go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for having me here. Congratulations on a fascinating, very data-rich report that is extremely thought-provoking. And I also share certainly Teri's sense of concern reading it. I think it does a fantastic job of highlighting the, at times, gaping chasm between elite discussions around some of these issues and the reality of public opinion, and the amount that we take for granted on some of this. It's really sobering. I just want to just make a few broader points before looking at a couple of the data points. More broadly, I remember, as I'm sure Teri was there too, at the NATO summit in Madrid, reading the strategic concept that was launched at that summit. And I thought it was really quite profound to see the degree of transatlantic consensus among states over the challenge posed by China. This was a subject of some debate among governments in the lead up to the summit, and it was by no means clear that we would see clear, sharp language around China's role. And as you recall, and I'm sure many of the viewers probably recall, because they're probably all in our transatlantic bubble to one degree or another, it did have fairly striking language on China, and that was facilitated by the Russian invasion of Ukraine, by China's initial sort of acquiescence in that invasion, we might say, the way that its state propaganda machine was turned in support of the invasion. And of course, the big Sino-Russian joint statement published just weeks before the invasion, in which we were promised a relationship without limits. And we had a great deal of speculation over whether China was given foreknowledge of the invasion, but it certainly showed no signs of rebuking Russia in any serious way. And then what that drove was a consensus that said, China presents a growing challenge to the Euro-Atlantic area in all these areas, and the Sino-Russian axis presents a serious challenge. And what we see here is, I think, a very different picture. I think we see that even at the state level, some of that momentum has faded. It has abated, and we noticed this at the last NATO summit, just the one we've just had in Vilnius, where we did not get a consensus on a measure that was as modest and minimal as the establishment of a NATO liaison office in Tokyo, which would have been an extremely low-profile, small, administratively light institution. And what was striking, of course, was that in the run-up to the event, this was framed as French opposition. I think we now have a clearer sense that that wasn't really just the case. And certainly when I interviewed Ben Wallace, the defense, until recently, the British Defense Secretary, I was really struck how he too opposed the opening of a NATO office in Tokyo, even though the Foreign Office, the Foreign Secretary didn't. There was a division over this topic. And what was more interesting than who opposed it or who didn't was the reasoning. And the reasoning was, this is mission creep. This is Europe getting involved in an area where it shouldn't be involved. And I think that that is a really profound failure of communication, because really, as we all, I think, understand, the purpose of this was to recognize that China was playing a greater role in Europe, posing a bigger challenge to Europe, and that this is something NATO had to deal with. It was not a question of NATO getting stuck into the South China Sea. And yet, if even defense ministers in relatively staunch transatlantic capitals were basically subject to that misperception, I think that tells us something very interesting about the nature of the gap. The second point I'd like to make is on Ukraine, and it's to say that we began this year with serious concern about China's potential role in Ukraine, particularly in arms provision, and the way that China might bail Russia out. Shells have been an absolutely a vital determinant of military power in this campaign. There are many factors at work, but the number of shells you have and the advantage in shelling you have over the opponent has been critical in shaping battlefield outcomes. And it looked as if China might provide significant support and ammunition to the Russians. And that was around the time of January. We saw that flare up at the Munich Security Forum. That didn't happen. It didn't happen for a great many reasons, but that was a potentially very disruptive element to US-Europe ties. I think European leaders were alarmed. We saw Joseph Borrell intervene on this subject with Wang Yi at the Munich Security Forum, and that we have to remember how contingent this was. Had the Chinese stepped in, perceiving Russia to be on the back foot, I think that could have profoundly affected the course of Europe-China ties and therefore US-Europe ties. And I think that hasn't completely gone away. The Russian military position remains quite fragile. I think we've explained in a cover story in The Economist this week, the Ukrainians have extreme weaknesses going into next year as well. But we don't know how things will develop. And if the Chinese decide to intervene and provide arms, I think that will have a outsized effect on lots of these discussions and factors. Right now, that looks to me less necessary. I think that the Chinese are principally worried about a significant Russian battlefield losses rather than simply enabling Russian offensives. They're more worried about Russian humiliation. But I think that's a risk we ought to keep in mind, and that could be a sort of a extremely disruptive factor in these things as well. And then finally, to the meat of the issue, which is kind of the sticking points in the US-Europe discussion around China. I think just it is really striking to see that all of those debates we were having last year around de-risking versus decoupling are absolutely there in full force, right? And it's notable that on these three areas where we see strong US support to try and shut down and curb the relationship or place significant limits on the relationship, we see a European appetite for cooperation with China. And those three areas are trade, energy, and raw materials. And we see in the data here in the report that European respondents are considerably more likely than US ones to support cooperation with China on new technologies, on trade, and on raw materials. And on trade, it's about 34% versus 26%. What astonishes me is that on technology, it's 40% versus 28%. So we see 40% of Europeans in this supporting cooperation with China on new and emerging technologies. And I'm staggered by that in a year in which we have had unprecedented levels of discussion around things like generative AI. We have a big AI safety summit coming up in the UK in just a couple of months. This is absolutely front and center of the agenda. We have vigorous debates around outbound investment screening. We are several years on from the Huawei debate and the perception that we allowed this debate to sort of drag on in extremely destructive ways around 5G telecommunications. And it seems to me we're back to square one on that issue, if that's really where public opinion is. And of course, we know that's not where governments are. Governments are much more risk averse and conscious of the security risks of cooperation with China on all of these areas, and de-risking absolutely applies to that. But their ability to bear economic costs, I think, is going to be very constrained by this. And of course, this is in a very substantial way a German problem as well, right? In Germany, if you look at the German presence in China, the revenues of German companies are about 6% of German GDP. That's about double the average of Europe's 6 biggest economies. And this problem is going to intensify given the difficulties we're seeing in the German economy today, and the fact that the energy question with Russia is not going to improve. So I feel this is all quite pessimistic, and none of this even begins to touch on the question of EU-US trade frictions, which I think are on the back burner for now, but are probably going to erupt in the next few months again as we begin to discuss steel, aluminium, raw materials, and a sense in Europe that actually these protectionist instincts haven't really gone away. So all in all, I feel pretty gloomy about some of these results. I think looking ahead to next year, the wave of elections is going to compound some of these difficulties and probably increase friction. And I'm sorry that I am not able to be somewhat more encouraging on that note.
That's all right. Thank you very much. And indeed, it's not perhaps a more optimistic view that we can bring to the conversation as we open the Q&A. You may have seen that we already have a few questions now, and I invite all of you to write your questions if you wish. Let me turn perhaps first to Alexandra, and the two questions in particular that I would like to address to you. One actually on India. India was not actually one of the answers to the question about global influence, but it would be interesting to know what you think we can draw from this report on how transatlantic public opinion perceive India as a partner, and also other global powers beyond Russia, China, the US, and the EU. Another question has to do with the impact of trade and competition, industrial competition between the US and Europe, on how each perceive themselves, and whether the sort of gloomy image that both Teri and Shashank shared with us can be also explained by these trade and investment tensions between the EU and the US. So Alexandra, if you want to take those, and I'll turn them to Teri and Shashank.
Sure. So we didn't include, the Indias, the Turkeys, the Brazils in the report. Maybe we should do so in forthcoming reports, but we just released, I think my colleague Jazine put it in the chat part, so you can access the report we released last May. We did a huge research work on how to rethink the way Europeans and Americans re-engage with these pivot states. We looked at Turkey, at India, Brazil, South Africa, and Indonesia, among others. And what is particularly striking is that we tried to extract the alliance strategies of these countries. So we kind of reversed your question, which was to say, how do these countries and India perceive the United States, the EU, in their alliance system? So you can find the Zoom on Turkey on in the publication, but what was interesting is that it depended, of course, on the policy areas. So typically on security or hard security, they would turn to the US, a little less to Europe, but they would also turn to Russia. On trade, Europe, the US, China, of course, technology, mainly the United States and Europe. And then when it came to international order or global governments, there you had a greater appetite to align with Russia, a little less with China, and looking at other partners like the BRICS or a few members of the G20. So what is absolutely fascinating is, of course, to see how do we Americans, Europeans perceive these countries, but it's also, and probably more important, to understand how do they perceive us in their alliance system. And that's why we call them, the global swing states, or, these pivot states or middle powers, because their strategy is much more fluid, probably, than ours. They don't look whether their partners are democracies or not. It's a very opportunistic way of dealing with the world politics. And so the EU and the US find themselves being perceived by these states as partners among other partners. So there is a really, I would say, total reset. I know we've been using this term a lot, but I think there is a total review, reset to do in US and European statecrafts in terms of how do we first understand these countries and how they perceive the world and how they perceive our foreign policies and domestic policies, and how do we reinvent the way we deal with these countries. So I really invite you to have a look at the detail on India that is available in the report we've put in the chat and on GMF website. Now, on the trade and investment part, I mean, you will not be surprised, and my colleagues on the panel as well, to learn that, the European reaction to the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, to the CHIPS Act before that, has generated a lot of hard reactions and pushback in Europe. Why? Because Europeans increasingly perceive themselves stuck in the middle, in that sort of uncomfortable in-betweenness position between the US and China. And all of the recent US legislation where it comes to investing in US industries, investing in US tech, by putting a lot of federal money in US industries, tech, etc., is indirectly impacting European industries. And so there again, I do believe that we need to foster and strengthen US-EU dialogue, conversation on these issues, because as Shashank was saying, I think all of these trade, investment, digital, tech issues are going to become increasingly points of frictions and tensions. And that's where, again, we see that in the trends, there is a call from citizens to see more cooperation on these I would say, hard security issues. So everything tech, trade, investment that obviously has energy as well, that has an impact on citizens' daily lives. So I'll just stop here.
Great, thank you very much. So we have quite a few questions. Let me try to compile some of them together. Maybe to Teri, because there are a couple of questions with regards to NATO's role vis-a-vis China. How do you think NATO can play sort of the link between the different transatlantic perspectives, but also whether NATO taking a larger role could trigger more disunity among allies? That's the question. I also would love to pick your brains on how you read the numbers with regards to Ukraine, whether you see the so-called fatigue in Europe and in the US. As you said, on the one hand, clearly there is support to give Ukraine, NATO accession, to have Ukraine becoming an EU member, to help with the reconstruction of Ukraine. On the other hand, as Alexandra mentioned at the beginning, Ukraine is not the top security priority for 11 out of the 14 countries. So how would you sort of connect the 2 points? And then I'll turn to Shashank for a couple of China-related questions.
That might be too much for me to connect all in one answer, but to go back to this first question about whether NATO can play a role on China, as Shashank mentioned, there's not complete agreement on China, but at NATO, there's, I would say, less disagreement than on the EU side and certainly on the trade and investment side, because NATO doesn't make rules and regulations. So they don't have to argue over the nitty-gritty to the degree that they do have to on the EU side. And this was certainly more sort of more front and center under the Trump administration, where you had US officials coming over and absolutely lambasting in public EU governments over their relationships with China and threatening to cut off intelligence cooperation with European governments if they did not sever their ties and stop using Chinese components in 5G and this kind of thing. It's certainly not out in the open anymore. It's not gone either. So as Alexandra mentioned on trade and investment, this will continue to be an issue of friction. Let me talk about a couple of things that NATO can do and has done to try to sort of blunt the concern about the military rise of China, but which is increasing cooperation with Indo-Pacific partners. This is the second summit where they have invited 4 Indo-Pacific leaders to the summit, and they've attended, and they're holding more and more meetings with them and really trying to reach out across the miles or the kilometers and build up those relationships. And I can say that that's not just coming from the NATO side, it is also coming from the partners. They are also asking for more, for a closer relationship with NATO. And this liaison office in Tokyo was something the Japanese very much wanted, and NATO really didn't think it was going to be a controversial issue, which is why they were sort of careless about letting the word get out about it. And that is one of the factors that doomed it. But one thing that NATO has done in cooperation with the EU, and that's the way that a lot of this has to be done, is that they have pressed allies to be more conscientious about selling national infrastructure to the Chinese. And there's been a big change in this, because you've got, for example, the ports in Greece almost wholly owned by China. So in case of a conflict, they would not be under Greek command if they were needed. You've got airfields in the Netherlands. There are all kinds of really important infrastructural components in NATO allies that are majority owned by the Chinese. So what NATO did was tell allies to knock that off. And then the European Union at the same time strengthened its rules on requiring governments to go to the EU with sales of national assets like this and get them cleared before they could sell them to any outside outside investor, but they were really aimed at China. So there is now more oversight on what China can buy in terms of potential military assets inside NATO allies. And I think that a lot of damage has already been done when nobody was looking and when nobody cared. But I think that they're much more concerned about this in the future. What was the so that would be my two these would be my two big points about what NATO can do. It's strengthen relationships in the Indo-Pacific and not letting China buy up strategic assets. In terms of how that, I don't know that that conflict over China will affect support for Ukraine. I don't really think so, but just a quick comment on unity over Ukraine. We've had just in the last couple of days, the last sort of 24 hours, concern that Poland said that it would stop delivering arms to Ukraine, but this is, I think it's been largely overwrought in the press. And because Poland hasn't been transferring its own arms now for several months because it had already sent so much. So this is sort of very much electioneering language. And I spoke with a US official this morning who said that they're not very concerned about it. They think it's election related, and they don't see any drop in the support that Poland is and will in the future be offering to Ukraine. So I really don't see a big crack in the unity. And we also hear that allies are coming up with more munitions even after saying their cupboards were bare, kind of thing, and that they will continue to support. They just had a Ramstein meeting this week, and there doesn't really seem to be a drop, at least in defense ministers' willingness to help supply Ukraine. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Teri. Shashank, there are quite a few questions, but I want to start with the generational gap. It was mentioned by Alexandra, by others. There's a striking difference in terms of what the 18 to 24-year-old perceive of China's influence in the world and what people who are 65 and plus see of China's role. And taking the UK as an example, 39% of the youngest respondents feel positive about China compared to 6% of the oldest respondents. What do you make of this? There's perhaps a question of an informational bubble, whether the sources of information drive this gap, or if there is something deeper that we should understand in terms of what the new generation perceives in China. And then we can maybe run a few other questions from the Q&A.
It's so interesting. I mean, I'm not a demographic or public opinion specialist, so I'm not sure what the cohort effects are. That is how these opinions evolve as each cohort gets older and goes through different stages of life. But what I do think is worth remembering at this stage is the occasional mushiness of public opinion. I was reminded of this when talking to my colleagues this week for writing a story on the sustainability of European support, and we were discussing Germany. And my colleagues in Germany pointed out to me that Schultz was very careful around the Leopard decision, as we all remember very well. But of course, what he learned was when he dispatched the tanks, when he agreed to authorize the sending of the tanks, public opinion shifted. Public opinion flipped after that decision to send the tanks, and it was an object lesson in the occasional kind of mushiness and flexibility of these sorts of opinions. On the UK question, again, I'm trying to understand the transmission between these opinions and foreign policy. And I am struck, because I'm sitting here in the UK, I can reflect a bit more on this, that when I think about China policy, Conservative Party policy, government policy has hardened considerably since the years of the Huawei debate. And of course, we, as people probably know, we've just had a scandal over Chinese influence operations in parliament and intelligence operations. But the Labour Party, which of course, as people again probably realize, depends for votes on the younger section of the population. It has far greater constituencies among students, younger professionals, and so on. Really is functionally indistinguishable in its China policy, and more than that, actually, in some areas, is extremely hawkish. And the bit I would highlight is the UK Labour Party's policy saying that it will pursue legal routes to declaring the Chinese crackdown on Uyghur Muslims a genocide if it wins the next election. So despite these kind of rather soft views on the threat posed by China, the challenges posed by China, I just kind of keep in mind that the link to that in foreign policy can sometimes be quite indistinct and indirect.
Good. Thank you very much. There is actually a question in the Q&A that sort of follow-ups what you're saying, whether public opinion follows policy rather than drives policy. And what you're saying, if I understand, is that there is this motioniness that, in a sense, we should not necessarily react to these numbers saying this is what will happen next year, but see it as a reflection of what happened in the past few months and have driven the population to think that way. And I wonder also if the two other speakers agree. Last question for you, Shashank, and then we'll have a very last round of reactions. There is a question actually related to whether you think that China would take the risk of encouraging North Korea to provide munitions to Russia, or actually to directly help Russia in the war in Ukraine, if it means that it would damage its relationship with Europe. This is, in fact, this is something that has been discussed since February 2022, but maybe if you could share your sense of what the reflection is on this very specific topic now.
I think that that's a very kind of self-absorbed way that we would look at the world, to think that this is about us. The Chinese, I think this also misunderstands the Chinese-North Korean relationship. The North Koreans have their own quite substantial pragmatic reasons to conduct a deal with Russia in which they receive hard currency, military technology, including rocket technology, in exchange for providing arms to a degree. They were quite shy about doing that. The Chinese will neither encourage them nor block them. The Chinese do not have that level of sway over the North Koreans, as we see again and again and again. In fact, it appears in the last 5 years, the China-North Korea relationship has been extremely poor. I think North Korea will provide some degree of assistance to Russia. I don't think China will have any say in that, will have any real influence over that decision. The much bigger question, militarily and diplomatically, is whether China provides its own weaponry to the Russians for use in Ukraine. And that decision has only been postponed, as I said, because of Russia's ability to withstand the Ukrainian offensive for this period. It could come back on the agenda, and I would not get complacent about it. I think that European leaders really have to be continually signaling to the Chinese that this issue remains a priority issue for them, because the risk is that the Chinese Communist Party effectively says, actually, it turns out the Europeans are distracted, they're focused on trade, we can quietly do this in the next 6 months in ways that wouldn't incur the same cost, and that would be a mistake.
Thank you. Okay, last questions really for Teri and Alexandra. Of course.
Just briefly. I mean, I think I would add to what Shashank says, that the Europeans need to keep the pressure on China, but also, I mean, the United States has made clear, and it says, in no uncertain terms, that if China were to provide weapons to Russia, there would be consequences beyond what it can imagine, and this kind of thing, using really, really strong language. And what I have heard from officials watching China's behavior is that China is quite happy to let Russia run down its stockpiles. It doesn't hurt China that Russia gets weaker at all, and that the United States is also spending so much money, and that the Europeans are spending so much money. If China's not using up any of its own stockpiles, albeit not making a lot of money selling to Russia, it's just sitting back there and minding its own business and building up its own its own military arsenals, while everyone else is consumed with the war in Ukraine. So as I understand it, China's quite happy to sit out right now, not be under extreme pressure from Russia to sell weaponry at the moment, and just watch everybody else basically spin their wheels.
We have about 2 minutes left. As you saw, there are quite a few questions, but maybe Alexandra, Teri, I would love to hear you on whether you think that the 2024 US election is already in people's mind, and that might also drive some of the results that you mentioned. There are a few questions related to Turkey. I don't know if you want to take those. We've seen actually in the report that Turkey's perception of NATO has improved over the past year. But on the other hand, Turkey is often in the total chart at the bottom as the ally that is the most skeptical of the role of NATO or the US. These are, open questions. I don't know who wants to start. Maybe you, Alexandra.
Yeah, sure. In a few seconds. Of course, the US elections are on everybody's mind. I think you cannot escape from that. And there's a lot of concern. I mean, sitting here, in Paris and in Europe, people are saying, well, could it be Trump again? And if it's Trump again, then I think that is going to be the biggest game changer for the transatlantic relationship, especially for countries like Germany, who are more in a position of strategic patience. France, as you know, it's strategic autonomy. And the more you move east, the more you have strategic embrace. And this obviously will have to be reconfigured. And I think that the whole debate about Europe's strategic autonomy will probably gain much more relevance. But even if it's a second Biden administration, on the trade, investment issues, on buying American, selling American, I think that's a trend. I don't call that protectionism. It's a sort of economic nationalism. It's about, defending your country's interests first. You see that a lot in the US. You see that a lot in European countries at a time where you need to boost your industrial base, your tech base in that broader US-China competition. I think that the non-military issues, the trade, investment, digital competition are going to become increasingly points of friction in the transatlantic relation. One last word on Turkey. Turkey is really interesting to study, and my colleague Jezine put the analysis of the Turkish way of seeing their alliance system. Once again, I think we are in an era of strategic de-risking, of mutual strategic de-risking. Turkey is looking for ways, of course, to remain connected to the West, member of NATO, the protection of Article 5, the war in Ukraine that has also fueled a lot of concerns in Turkey, even though it's playing its balancing role. So it's still going to be about keeping close ties with the United States, with traditional alliances, while diversifying elsewhere. You see the same with our relationship with China. We are investing immensely in China as we are decoupling from Russian energy. A lot of European countries are saying, sorry, we cannot decouple from China, we cannot de-risk from China, and we need to continue to invest in the Chinese market. Yet we are also paying much more attention. I saw a question, in the Q&A. Have Europeans, become more robust vis-a-vis China? Yes, I think China is starting to accelerate the geopolitics inside the EU. We are realizing that short-term economic investment, trade relationship, and choices with China can have longer-term geopolitical strategic consequences. And this is where I would like to see the US and Europeans having a much more healthy and constructive conversation about China. I don't see that at all for now. I don't think the Trade and Tech Council is the right format. So let's, as GMF, try to come up with a more relevant and actionable formats.
Well, thank you very much. Teri, any last words?
Just a quick, to answer the same questions quickly at the end. If you didn't know anything else about Turkey's role in NATO, reading this report, it looks very benign, very positive, numbers out of Turkey regarding NATO, regarding US influence. In reality, there is huge friction about Turkey inside NATO right now, blocking Sweden, continuing to block Sweden, possibly, maybe not approving it in October. Enormous apprehension about how Turkey's going to behave, not to mention its relationship with Russia. You can't get that from this report, how stressful that relationship is. At the same time, NATO needs Turkey. much better having Turkey inside than outside the alliance. It is really a difficult ally to manage for a lot of the other members. And just on the U.S. elections, people have been talking about this already for more than a year. It's not just now. Everybody's worried. Everybody's worried about what a Trump candidacy, a Trump win would mean for NATO, and you will not have the Trump whisperer, Jens Stoltenberg. They cannot extend him anymore to be NATO Secretary General, and everybody's afraid who on earth could manage another Trump presidency without Stoltenberg at the head of NATO. That's why they kept him so long, but he's not staying anymore. Well, God forbid, famous last words. But anyway, there's a lot of concern at NATO about the US elections.
Thank you. Well, we've passed time, but thank you very much, Shashank, Teri, Alexandra, for your analysis and for sharing your thoughts today. Thank you all for joining us for this event. I would say do not hesitate to go to our website to look at the report and look at all the data. Really, there's a lot to read there. I will wish you a very good day and hope to see you all very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.